Yeah. We can't hear.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
And the first and the 8th day of this 2-week refresher course, we have been we've had wonderful sessions across all these 7 days. I, Dr. Syed Mubin Zahra, feel delighted and very happy to welcome all the participants today to the 8th day and the first session of the 8th day. This has been an online bilingual interdisciplinary refresher course. The topic of this refresher course has been Indian folk traditions, a tapestry of diversity. I, on behalf of Atmaram Sanatan Dharma IQAC, Professor Vinita Tuli, and our principal, Professor Gyantosh Kumar Jha, and my entire team, I feel very happy to welcome you and introduce our speaker of the first session, that is Dr. Rakesh Pandey. Dr. Rakesh Pandey is associated with Center for the Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, Delhi. As I was requesting Rakesh ji for a lecture, and then I asked for his designation. He's a very modest scholar, and he loves to work silently and make a big noise with his work. I have known him since my JNU days, and I know that his work is great, and we all are going to have a lovely session. Dr. Rakesh is going to talk on, since he's a historian, he's going to talk on the topic that he has chosen. I'll just share it with you, my friends. The topic of his lecture is going to be many paths of the folk, tradition, memory, and the cultural nation. Before I give the podium to Dr. Rakesh, it's my honor and it's my duty to introduce you to Dr. Rakesh Pandey, who is associated with CSDS, as I already mentioned. He has been a student, he says, he has studied ancient history and the philosophy at the University of Allahabad. Following it up, he has a postgraduate degree in modern history at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He did his amazing and very interesting doctoral work on the making of archaic and classical forms of cultural knowledge in colonial India at SOAS, the most prestigious School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Shri Pandey's research interest is in the area of cultural and intellectual history of modern India, with particular focus on knowledge formations, philosophy of culture, and moral orders. He is currently working on a monograph dealing with aspects of colonial archaism together with a study on interpretations of pre-colonial textual traditions in North India, and another on philosophical aesthetics and the anti-modern, focusing on Ananda K. Kumaraswamy, among others. He has been actively involved with the center's teaching initiative, that is the CSDS, where he's associated with, researching the contemporary and the Indian language program. Shri Rakesh ji has also taught modern history at the University of Hyderabad. This is just a bit of his introduction and his academic engagements, and he refused to reveal more. But as he speaks on the topic, and as we discuss the interesting topic that he's going to speak on, I'm sure the participants here are going to gain a lot from Dr. Rakesh's vast knowledge on the subjects. Rakesh ji, I welcome you to Atmaram Sanatan Dharma's this initiative of 2-week refresher course, and we are greatly honored to have you. Welcome, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mubin, and I'm very grateful to Mubin, my old friend. We go back to our university days as researchers, and it's a real pleasure to come and speak to the scholars here. And of course, ARST College, which is now many of us know and the world knows is one of the most prestigious colleges in Delhi University, and not only a South Campus college, but it's a known college in the country now because of its various achievements. So this is my real pleasure being part of this group where I can speak to my contemporaries, my colleagues, on a topic which interests me in a very different way. I'm not a scholar of folk studies or folklore, and as we know that these are independent disciplines in themselves. There are centers of folklore and folk studies. Even in our country, in my older university, in Hyderabad University, there is a thriving center of that. So I'm not coming from that disciplinary perspective, but given the fact that this is an interdisciplinary gathering and a course, I think we can talk about this issue of question of folk from my vantage point, my perspective, which is a modern historian who is interested in largely the issues of intellectual history, the history of ideas, concepts, knowledge systems, thoughts, and what could be more intriguing and complex and challenging concept than folk itself. So that said, my topic, as you all know, is about many pasts of the folk, tradition, memory, and the cultural nation. What I'll try to do here is uh, to explore the concept in relation to these keywords which you see in my title, and then check what we can do something around this concept. It means the way a modern historian can actually engage with the idea of folk itself, the concept of folk itself. Mm. As we know, it's a folk in itself is a seemingly naive and also a very overused term. At the same time, it poses many challenges once we try to understand it. As it happens with many things which are so close to us, especially the set of ideas, languages, our affective notions, and various concepts with which we live, closer they are, difficult they become to understand, and they pose different sets of questions. Folk is definitely one of the terms in that series. So let's begin with the meaning of the term folk itself, and think, because it's the refresher course is going on for almost a week. So you may have come across these things. So there might be some duplication, but just for the sake of building up the problem and to understand and engage in a discussion, we might have to go through this. So the very first thing is that as we understand it, it ranges from a very general, very general idea of what we call a collective or a group in general, and we say that this is a folk. So that's one sense which we extend from, and folk could be around that collective could be around any living thing. More centrally, when we talk about folk in our context, we try to think of a set of people, a set of collective as people. And this could be a very literal, very simple sense of folk. But there is another sense which is very important, and which from modernist perspective becomes very important, is the what folk is seen as something which actually is linked to or emerges from what has been or what is for us natural. And as we all know from the basic history of this term, is that folk is something which is related to the well-known romantic idea, romantic philosophical, cultural, and literary aesthetic tradition in the late 18th century Europe as it started. And in that sense, it becomes in a distinct modern sense of collective in the romantic, as it emerged from the romantic philosophical and aesthetic milieu in the late 18th century. It gives a very close sense of the natural, something which is given to us, something which is natural, which is close to the given world, the way the world is given to us. So that's one a very important distinction. And gradually then through the 19th century and the later in the modern period, what we see is that the idea of the folk increasingly becomes a culturalist notion, a notion which is centrally linked to the idea of culture itself. And then folk actually gets linked up, and at the same time, it actually poses a series of very, very nebulous, ambivalent connotations of what we know as the people. So the people and the culture, if these are the two very important key words, in relation to which, in the modern sense, we try to understand the idea of folk. This is the culturalist, let's call it the culturalist sense. So what I'm referring to is that the three broad divisions, one is a very literal sense, the other is about the collective and the people. The second is what one can call is the philosophical sense, which is coming from the romantic notion of the folk. And the third is the deeply culturalist sense, where the people slash folk, people as folk and people and folk actually emerges as a new category. In that sense, I think once we take the people in the culturalist sense, folk slash people in the culturalist sense, then it is actually seen as a repository of primal natural forms of living and experiences, affective form, aesthetic forms, and several other forms of culture as we can imagine. So folk actually becomes a repository. Folk is something which actually most of our primal cultural notions and living sense are actually posited. So if this is the very clear three kinds of senses we can work out, then I'll gradually try to explore and explain to you the way this actually, the modern idea of folk actually evolves. Now, the modernist sense of the folk, as it is shared by, let's talk about what happens from the romantic, philosophical, literary, and aesthetic idea onwards in the 19th and 20th century largely. 19th century story is a very important story because that is where the culturalist sense of folk is actually created and instituted. And that's the idea of the folk with which actually we work with even in our own times. It is also the 19th century in which we find that the idea of the folk, the way we know it in our own human and social sciences, is actually created and forced. Folk then becomes gradually, through the 19th century, a realm of loss. And since it is a realm of loss, it means folk is something which is in the modern industrialist civilization, which is about to be lost or which is getting lost. And that is why the whole attempt at collection, discovery, classification, preservation, and also at the same time, invention of tradition. So folk becomes part of, as we know in the famous phrase of Eric Hobsbawm, it becomes part of the invention of tradition project. It's actually the folk which actually becomes the site of the invention of tradition. And there are many, many studies and many attempts to explore it as we know. So from the nature culture dichotomy, now here we come. Why the culturalist notion is important through the 19th century is that the great, as we know, the great nature culture dichotomy actually becomes so important that this 19th century disciplinary form of folk or disciplinary idea of folk, which was in the folk as being explored by distinct 19th century modern Western forms of knowledge. And the redefinition actually, it starts emerging there. At the same time, apart from the what we call as the nature culture distinction, folk is actually also marked by another distinction. And it is at the cusp of that, which is what we can call is that whether folk belongs to the realm of the historical, or folk is something which is, because it is the repository of the natural and the primitive and the primordial, is actually something which is the repository of the ahistorical. So at the same time, we see that there is a fissure and there are various specters which are hanging over the very idea of the folk through the 19th century. And these systems of knowledge, as I'm calling them, the modern disciplinary systems, which evolved through the 19th century in Europe, actually try to get hold of this concept. Our understanding, the modern understanding of the idea of folk, comes from that very intellectual tradition. Now, it's very important to understand this long intellectual history, which begins in the late 18th century philosophical quest. It's also a quest which is part of a grand fissure in the intellectual culture of West or Europe itself, where from the Romanticism on, from the Enlightenment onwards. So the Enlightenment project is almost reaching its peak by the late 18th century, and there is a romantic challenge to it, where the revival of several, what one can call is that the atavistic, autochthonous, primeval forms of human existence and culture actually become important. They are articulated in a deep philosophical argument battle against the Enlightenment tradition. This is a known history. But just to plot it, the way the whole idea of folk comes to us, to a non-Western context, because we are actually talking about Indian tradition, Indian context, and various ways in which the whole idea of folk actually emerges in India. As a lost realm, as we have just mentioned, as a lost realm, folk actually also gradually through the 19th century poses the third distinction. The first was nature culture, and then history and ahistorical. The third is the culture civilization itself. So this is the third distinction emerges. Now folk is at the center of these key categories, modern categories with which we work, which are emerging, being and evolving in the 19th century. Now, interestingly, all these categories themselves are being redefined and forced in the 19th century intellectual history, West itself, where it is history, culture, civilization, nature. So this formation is going on. And this distinction, the culture civilization distinction, again becomes a third defining element or ground for the idea of folk as it emerges in the 19th century. And lastly, by the early 20th century and the 20th century, the whole idea of folk actually takes a new turn. When folk actually defines a certain idea of people, in the sense that people who are actually the way people, the idea of people is linked to the idea of nation itself. And the nation people distinction emerges by the late and early 20th century, where once again, folk as the primordial collective, the original collective actually is at the heart of it. By the mid 20th century, the last century, we find that the nation people distinction is reaching to its own limit. It's challenged by the way the idea of nation actually reaches the concept of or concretizes, concretion happens in the idea of nation state. And then the term folk actually is taken by the term people. And at the same time, what happens to folk is very, very interesting. Its culturalist beginning in the 19th century gradually are distanced, and at the same time, folk actually becomes a subject of study, is actually which is to be explored, which is to be collected, which is to be preserved, and one can say that which is to be museumized in the sense. Is part of a spectacle and representation. Now, this is a very It's a kind of intellectual overview of just one concept as it evolves through the period. And I think this will help us as we enter into a certain discussion in the end. So if this is the broad history of the emergence of this concept, then what are the fundamental questions around the idea of the folk, the way we use it? As we know that the famous German word in the early first half of 20th century, where for woke and people, actually people is known as the woke, and as giving a sense of the primordial sense of the people, originary people who are part of a nation or a certain kind of national imagination. Now the question of folk then turns to the several other sets of problems which emerge around it. Who is the folk, and for whom is the folk? Who belongs to the folk, as we say that when we talk about folk culture and folk tradition, we have distinct notions of who are the people who belong to that very folk. At the same time, who speaks for, who preserves that folk, who represents that folk, who museumizes that folk, that again becomes another distinction. At the same time, taken in a more distinct sense, one can say that if folk is just not about the lost, but at the same time a surviving culture in large parts of the world, then who belongs to that? Who is living that very folk tradition and culture? Who marks that folk, very living tradition of that? In contrast to those who study it, those who mark it, classify it, and try to, as I said, speak for it. Now, if this is the problem, this is the way in which what we otherwise see as a very beautiful, very evocative idea of folk, as we are now trying to say it, is actually quite a complex set of questions around it and issues around it. It's not as naive as I began right in the beginning, as we tend to think about it, or the way in which the whole business and whole industry or even intellectual exercise around folk is actually posited. If we try to look at the way in which folk is about the lived life, it's about the human condition, it's about human past and living history at the same time. Now we come to, after this overview, now we come to certain binaries or certain both terms which are linked to and but at the same time are posited to the concept of folk. Now take one very well-known distinction, which I'm sure that in other discussions, other lectures, this must have been talked at length, which is the folk classical, a very well-known binary and distinction. Whenever we utter the word folk, somewhere at the back of the mind there is a term which is just hanging there, hovering around, and that is the classical. So there is a certain distinction which is created. Folk always stands in, it's very curious, enigmatic, and interesting fact about this term is that it always comes to us by its sets of what we call is binaries, or something which haunts it, to which it is linked, and at the same time to which it actually establishes a very distinct relationship. So folk classical, which is at one level, it's something which we everyday use it and we all think that we understand. It's one of the most complex things to understand in social sciences, in humanities, in folklore studies, in history. So if this is the one beginning, the main distinction is between the folk and the classical. Folk, something which is living, which is the natural, which is primordial, primeval, surviving, is actually posited against something which is given to us, systematic, standardized, which is known as the classical. Folk and classical distinction comes in. Now, there are three key, once again, terms which actually stare at folk. One is history itself. For long, we know that for historians, it has been very, very difficult and has been a huge challenge how to use folk as a source in historical method courses. And there have been several camps in which this has been debated, whether the folk element or the folk evidence or folk source, as historians are very fond of saying, of their own, where in what ways can it be used as a historical evidence? It means as a reliable evidence for thinking about or writing about what is known as the historical past. That's one thing. The other is linking folk to the tradition. If folk directly goes to the tradition, then there is another it's very easy, as you know, that in India itself, we mostly use the term folk in relation to a well-known word, parampara, lok parampara, folk tradition. And there are so many words from the stage to classrooms in our everyday discussions. We keep talking about lok parampara, which is just one way to talk about certain kind of cultural practice and form. But it's very hard to define what is lok parampara, because it's so hard to define what is parampara in that sense, distinct from. The other thing is that memory itself. Occasionally, people use this word, the memory of the folk, but it's much more difficult, as difficult as folk and history distinction is, folk and traditional distinction is, and folk and memory distinction is. At one level, it is a slightly easier problem because folk is also seen as a repository of memory. So for our collective memory, we resolve it is that for our memory, it's the folk which actually carries our memory at the same time. But what is folk memory? Lok smriti. We use this term lok smriti. We don't use the term lok itihas very often, because historians are very, very guarded about their discipline, about their methods, and the way the folk or the oral and that kind, because folk is related to oral material, could be used as evidence. And finally, it comes to, as we begin with, the big problem of folk and the classical, which stares at it, because classical is something which is available to us because it is textualized, it is standardized, it is canonized. There are ways in which we can reach out to classical. And folk is something which actually is mirrored in the classical. To many people, folk, to many sensitive scholars, folk mirrors the classical. At the same time, folk stands in contrast to the classical. Or it can also be seen to be anti-classical. It stands against the classical. Now, these are the big problems. These are the big issues which are discussed in scholarship. But then once we come to a much closer to our own times and the mid-20th century, where we stopped in our general overview of the conceptual history of folk itself, is that when the distinction of folk and the classical comes to the going through the distinctions with folk history, folk tradition, folk memory, to the folk versus the nation. Because nation, again, carries so much of ambiguity around itself, unless we try to call it nation state, which is a completely different. But nation itself, because nation in some senses is one modern category which tends to claim all these in its domain. So nation is ready to claim from folk to history to tradition to memory to everything. So it becomes an overarching, all subsuming category. And those who try to jealously guard this concept and are not sensitive to its history, then they just get a blurred imagination, as if nation can very happily contain all these. But history tells us something else, and intellectual history tells us a very different story, is that although nation and the claims on behalf of the nation are made for all these culturalist and notions, but at the same time, nation itself it stands in a very embattled relationship to these concepts itself. Now, if this is the typology, then think about a very well-known, very common sense in which, as we started, folk classical, to the distinction between the folk and the popular. What popular does is that many a times we collapse it, and we tend to think is that the folk is the popular. That's a big question. Is folk popular? Then one has to say that Hindi films, or what we call Bollywood, is folklore or it's folk form. But I don't think that any one of us would agree that Hindi cinema is a folk form. No, not at all. But at the same time, we would say that Hindi cinema and is, or Hindi film songs are actually popular forms of culture. Now, once again, this blurring, this distinction between the folk and the popular. So there are uses of folk in Hindi cinema or popular painting or printmaking or calendar art, all kinds of modern art forms. We talk about, look, this is the use of the folk, but this is the popular. Now, popular actually is a much complex category like folk itself, and it's a very modern category. Hmm. The way we try to understand folk, it is the meaning is very modern, but the weight on the term folk is a very, very long historical weight. There is a weight of tradition, history, and memory on the idea of folk. On the other hand, the term popular, as we understand, is actually a very modern term, very modernist term. And this again has a very complex relationship with the idea of the folk itself. Now, these are the key problems around the term. And as I said, that I'm going to speak to you as an intellectual historian, someone who's interested in ideas and concepts. And what we do as intellectual historians is that our key obsession or our key passion is actually such distinction and such ideal. So in some ways, we work in between language and philosophy, criticism and philosophy. And that is why before we start doing history itself, before I perform the task of historian or I enter into historiography, this analytical exercise itself is or key to any exercise of history of ideas or intellectual history, because unless these distinctions are worked out, I won't be able to talk about it, because these concepts itself, these are the evidence for me, these are my sources, and these are our sources. So actually I'm working with the source material, which is the concept of folk itself here. And as an intellectual historian, I'm trying to give you a sense, the way one can actually talk about from the history of ideas perspective or intellectual history perspective. What we see is that while I have been giving you these binaries and these challenging terms, or these challenging relationship with these terms in which folk stands, as I said, the classical history, tradition, memory, nation, popular. So it's both linked to it and it is both challenged by it. So what happens is that we see that the folk is a term which actually slips, and there is a huge slippage from, as we began with the sense of the primal sense of a repository of human culture or human forms of culture, to something which is very natural and primeval, to something. Once we come to the popular, it actually brings to our to modern times from a different perspective, where the culture, the large shared culture, the collectivity, actually is it happens through mass production and mass consumption. We never talk about folk as a mass. Popular is a mass form. And there is always a kind of naturalistic, romantic ring to the idea of folk itself, even today when we talk about it. While popular is a term which has the idea around it, the idea of the both the mass production, and also the mass culture, the larger collectivity of culture, which is the hallmark of modern industrial civilization, in which we are living at the same time. In some senses, I have tried to just give you a sense how one can plot it conceptually. Uh, just to give you a sense in which, if this is the brief history of the concept of folk or the idea of folk itself, then let's quickly, in a very short time, short span of time, I'll give you two parallel histories of the term folk, modern histories. Some of it I have actually already hinted at, but in some senses I'll also be summarizing is that what happens is that there is a Western history of the concept. Partly I have referred to that, where what happens is that from the great grand Enlightenment romantic divide to the redefinition of culture emerges in the mid 19th century. Those who know about the whole literature around that, most famously Raymond Williams and others who know the whole history of culture, which is there in anthropology and ethnography. To the historical context of the term itself. But when we talk about the historical context of the emergence of the idea of folk in the 19th century, one thing which I haven't yet mentioned, but this is the time I should bring it in for our own discussion, is that there is a parallel non-Western history of this concept itself. So there are now the two parallel histories which are emerging here, which we haven't talked about, but now we should bring in is that, and that non-Western history is important. The way the idea of the folk evolves in the 19th century Europe itself. And it's important on two counts. One is, as we know, from the late 18th century onwards, this is the period in which in the West and the Western countries and culture actually establishes huge empires. It reaches out to the non-Western, larger, most parts of the world. Rather than calling it the non-Western, we should call it the most of the world, the remaining world, the larger part of the world, to its, which is about the new kind of imperial formation where trade is important, modern state formation is important, commerce is important, and at the same time, knowledge formations are also important, to which we will come later, in which the whole idea of folk emerges. The other is the great culturalist, historicist understanding of non-Western culture, which is created by the West itself. And it happens at three major registers. One is the idea of language itself, discovery of languages as it happens, and textual cultures, definition of the people, because it is just connected to that, as people, collectives. The others are actually defined in this intellectual exercise. And finally, the way culture itself of these people are defined. Folk actually is at the center of that. In these three definitions of the language, people, and the culture of non-Western people by the Western societies themselves, as the Western colonial empire spreads and the colonialism is instituted. So what, in short, I'm trying to hint it is that what up till now we have been telling as largely a Western story of the emergence of the idea of the folk, as of the concept of the folk, has a very important and rich history of non-Western culture, because they also become the labs, some kinds of labs of what is happening in the Western intellectual history is being actually both projected and recast for the non-Western societies itself. So as we know that what happens in the 19th century, parallel to it, three major disciplines evolve. One is philology itself, which is almost a kind of scientific, detailed study of language itself, because language is seen as a source of various other forms of culture, people being very important. If you, and in Indian context, we know that the great question of the language and people as it emerges in the Aryan and non-Aryan and all these questions. The other is ethnology, ethnography. The people who are the non-industrial, non-urban collectivists. Ethnology as a science. It's a science of humans. Literally, it's a science of humans. But most of these humans are the humans of the non-Western world, non-Western society. And we know that this is very much part of the Western intellectual Enlightenment history as the empires grow and the colonial knowledge formation takes place. And finally, when we talk about folk, while we know that it's a deeply culturalist notion, there is a very important scientific ring to it. Because as we know, in the 19th century, especially from 1850s onwards, as the modern disciplines of human and social sciences emerged and evolved in the 19th century Europe, the non-Western world is not only a lab and not only a site of projection, but at the same time, a site of experimentation and classification itself. And that comes from evolutionary science, where once again people are being classified and different forms of human culture and nature are actually projected on evolutionary science. Actually, folk very much, because folk is something which is defined by the people's practices, people's lives, something which marks people's life. So science becomes. So it's important, as we see that from the 1850s onwards, ethnology, folklore, and not only in what happens from the 18th century onwards in the Europe, but especially in 19th century. In the second half of 19th century, we know this history of ethnological societies, archaeological surveys, and the folklore societies, folklore studies, colonial officials, bureaucrats, scholars actually are moving around the country and classifying and writing about the folklore. North Indian notes and queries, NNQ, Punjab notes and queries, PNQ, all these things which are seen as the resources are actually attempts at collecting the folk life and folk culture in some sense. So this is the parallel history which emerges, which is a history of colonial knowledge formation. So what we otherwise know as a history of beautiful and naive, popular and well-known notion of folk is actually something which is evolving on a very grand design of knowledge formation in the modern period, which we in modern intellectual history call it the colonial knowledge forms, knowledge formation, as some of you know. And those of you know Bernard Cohn's work and several other works are after that. He actually creates a typology of that kind of thing as different ways in which these disciplines are emerging and the culture and the people and different forms are being classified. And there are discourses, institutions, systems of knowledge which all evolve. And what is important about the term folk itself is that once it is seen as a marker of most of the non-Western society, people and their lives and their cultures. And that is why it somehow it is ingrained in the ways in which the understanding of modern culture has evolved. Now, it's not given this kind of overview, it won't be very difficult for us as very soon as I'll give you certain examples of the way we have tried to understand folk in India itself, in our own intellectual traditions, and especially in our own languages, and the way we actually use and describe it. So what happened to, and this is a question I raise to you and to myself, is that what happened to the Indian story of folk then? This is a story maybe in this refresher course we are trying to tell in different ways from different perspective. I'm speaking from a very, very narrow perspective, which is the perspective of going back to the concept and tracing the way in which it has come to us. But this history of this concept or this idea of folk is just not a clinical or exercise in looking into this. It is actually to open up this ways in which the senses and the meaning of folk has come to us and we understand it and we practice it. So I think this is the right time that we raise this question. First question, was there any idea of folk in grand Indian tradition, intellectual, cultural tradition in the long history of India? Was there anything like folk? That's the very first question which should come to us, which should strike us. And I'm sure that once I have raised it, almost all of you or most of you must have said, yes, why not? And there is a certain peg for us from where this answer is coming, and it's already there at the back of our minds. We all are ready with it. So let me announce this term. It's in fact the story of one rich term which we call lok. And we all are familiar with this word. And as the title of this course itself goes, Lok Parampara, Lok Sahitya, Lok Sanskriti. So the key word is lok. And interestingly, this term lok has become a ready translation of what we call folk. So if lok is there, and this is the term which is available in the long Indian intellectual, literary, cultural, religious tradition, then what stops us from thinking that, of course, we had an idea of folk. But given the kind of history which I have given to you here, I would be also interested as a historian to check if at all this lok is actually the folk. And what do we mean by lok as folk or folk as lok? And if at all, by folk we mean lok, and by lok we mean folk, then we should be try to check what are the ways in which we actually try to make sense of it. But at the same time, we should also be aware of there are various other terms which we use around this term lok itself. Now, there is a very important term. Jan is a very important term, as we know, which is about this human collective. The term samaj, which we use for society, is actually about collective. Literally, it comes, if you look at any Sanskrit dictionary, you'll come to know it. It comes from the collective, and in its root term samaj, actually it's any kind of collective, any living collective actually. While by samaj we try to understand it. So lok is a collective in some senses. There are various other terms which actually are used for collectives in our sense, and for human collectives there are other terms like Jan is a very important term which is available to us. And the lok and the Jan and these kinds of terms are available in the Buddhist tradition, in the long, what we call is the Hindu tradition, or classical traditions, or our own larger traditions, heretic, non-heretic. But this term is there, this is available there, while at the same time it is available to us as what I call as a translation. Now, the way this term has come, and we try to understand lok, or if we try to understand why in a refresher course in social sciences and humanities and interdisciplinary, we are talking about the lok, and here is that what I'm hinting is that it is just not about a culture within the nation, larger nation statist, because nation is mostly nation state for many of us, most of us, we try to collapse it and see it like that. So it is a story of just not about a culture which is to be, which should be part of the spectacle of the nation, which should be part of the certain kind of grand, great Indian tradition or Hindu tradition or any other tradition which we can talk about. But it is something which should be understood in the context that the story of this concept or our understanding of folk, and as a translation in modern times, lok itself is a story of a grand cultural, a very intense cultural encounter, which happens in the modern period through the mediation in the colonial context. It is also a linguistic encounter, an encounter in language, because as we go back in the way the lok is used, and we can take several examples, one can actually make a very good inventory, because this term intrigues me a lot, and I have tried very hard to go into its deeper history, is that it's available in very different ways, from the ancient Sanskrit text to the Buddhist text to the Jaina texts. In the first millennium AD, in Sanskrit literature, it is there. In the grand Bhasha tradition, in the second millennium, as it evolves, it is there. And it is there in Sur, it is there in Kabir, it is there in Tulsi, it is there in Jayasi. Everywhere this term comes. But is it hard? Is it folk for in there, or is there any idea of folk as it evolves there? That's one question. In modern uses, of course, it stands like that. Because there is a certain way in which, as I started this lecture, folk actually, our understanding of folk and lok, and now I'm going to use both the terms, because that is how we use it, is that actually has this concretion or layering or enveloping around the tradition, memory, culturalism, all that is there. But what is important to understand is that the understanding of, because that is how a lot of people who are not strictly coming from a historical understanding or historical perspective would say that, why don't you leave lok as lok and keep it part of tradition, and keep it part of memory, keep it part of the larger shared cultural understanding. Historians would be a bit wary. They are, our social scientists would be wary. Is that because they are interested in those fuzzy boundaries? That is why we do science. That is why we do humanities. And what happens is that, as you see in my title, I use a phrase in the end, which is an important phrase: cultural nation. And it is the cultural nation. At the heart of the cultural nation is a certain understanding of the folk itself, but not in one sense, but in a very, very stretched sense, in the sense that folk is at the heart of the cultural nation. Folk is something which takes us to our deepest past, the longest possible past one can imagine. That's one part of it. The other is to a very tangible way in which one can have the folk performance in a craft mela, as it happens today, or in a craft museum. You have folk things displayed there, which is very, very tangible. Or as a parade in the 26th, on the Republic Day, you have the folk traditions which are being spectacled and shown, which is a very tangible way where the nation is projecting its folk tradition, its own folk tradition, where nation itself is actually creating, or is actually projecting and displaying, representing the roots, or it's very ground of the cultural nation. That is how it happens. I would say that if this is the story of folk, from the well-known distinction of folk classical, folk popular, to the way folk enters into the cultural nation, the idea of the cultural nation, then some of you, those who are interested in this kind of literature, would be knowing that there is one way in which it was distinguished by scholars like various other scholars, was one well-known name which would be familiar to most of you, is that the way in which Culture and Society, Raymond Williams, the Marxist literary critic, talked about the evolution of this concept. But at the same time, the way this idea of the concept was used, another Marxist thinker, very important, Gramsci, as he tried to talk about national popular. And in the national popular, at the heart of the national popular, while he's looking into the various forms of contemporary popular mass cultural forms, from pamphlets to newspapers to novels to cultural forms, at the same time, being a grammarian himself, Gramsci actually is thinking very hard what exactly is creating this idea of the national popular, which is a very complex term which Gramsci uses. I'm just flagging it for the discussion in case it interests some of you. But what remains intriguing and important, and I'm coming almost to the end because I have taken almost 15 minutes, in the next 5 minutes I'll conclude, is that what is important about in this trajectory of the way I've been laying out from the, we all think that we understand the folk classical distinction to folk actually has a very complex idea in the idea of the cultural nation itself. It is at the heart of the cultural nation. Is what happens is that the history, culture, nation, if these are the key terms around which folk is embedded, then popular is one which haunts it, which is there. Where is the, which is about the name of the people. But popular is still manageable because it is the modern collective as we try to understand it. The folk is more difficult term. Lok is much more difficult. Why? And I'll give you the hint which you will be able to appreciate and understand, is that because folk carries the sense of what is atavistic, what is autochthonous, and what is something primeval, primordial. It means that it's hard to pin down its origin, although it is something which defines our origin. It means for a collective, even for the collective within the cultural nation actually, or national culture, unlike the popular, what folk does is that it actually leaves us with a nagging, intriguing sense of something which is ever alive, which is originary, from where things emerge. But maybe for some, it will be a puzzle. It will be a big question about the imagination of cultural nation and folk itself. To many who believe in the idea of the hyper nationalism or hyper cultural nationalism, which is actually contained in the modern idea of the nation state, it is not at all a puzzle, because this is the dream of the concept of nation itself. Nation has to go back to its origin, and it constantly actually reminds you of its deepest and unfathomable origin. Now, what is important is that what in some senses I have been suggesting is that how folks' naivety is actually contained in our modern understanding in the very ingrained complexity which is at the heart of cultural nation, especially when it is actually seen to be marked by the nation state, cultural nation state, which is looking for its autochthonous, primeval, and atavistic roots which are available to us. Now, let me leave you with just a quick set of questions. One is folk then a lived concept? Is folk tradition, or is folk simply part of our national myth or nation statist myth, the way we understand it? Or more importantly, if we go back to what Levi-Strauss, the great thinker, anthropologist, and thinker in the last century, reminded us, because he studied non-urban, non-industrialized traditions in the Latin American countries, is that whatever we try to think about the as an anthropologist at the people standing there, is that does it exist as an unbroken thing? Is there a mark of something which is not broken at some level by the mark of what we call the modern civilization or modernity itself? Even our understanding of folk, which we otherwise tend to and happily think that, well, this is a rather pure, neat concept. I think as a historian, we try to understand that such neatness is hard to fathom. These concepts actually are given to us in those things. Or at the same time, one can say that what we see as folk, which is pure, neat, and lived, natural, cultural form, it's something, it's just a mere modern contemporary memory which we have created. or maybe more than that, it is a contemporary national memory at the same time. All these are mere shadows. Under the shadow of all these questions which I'm raising are there hanging or standing in under the shadow of what we call, what I would like to claim and argue, is a historicist understanding of culture itself. And within the historicist understanding of culture, the idea of culture, the concept of folk actually is available to us. What it does is, and we should remind right now, we are in 2023, that at the same time, we go back to the question of nature in a very distinct way. Not only the historicist specter, which is hanging on the idea of the folk itself. But once again, and this is just the beginning, as we are trying to understand it, what we are calling is that there is a way in which there is a crisis of climate. There is a crisis in our own environment. And there is a rethinking on nature itself going on. Now, what it has done, it is doing right now in contemporary understanding, both in sciences, in humanities and social sciences, and as some of you may be knowing, on the study of Anthropocene and all that is evolving, the new areas, is a certain going back to the romantic question itself, both philosophically, aesthetically, and culturally. I think in some senses, what I have done is that in a suggestive way, I have tried to plot a certain history of this concept and the problem. Mubin, do I have a couple of minutes? Or I should stop here?
No, you can conclude. You can conclude with whatever you want to say.
Yeah. So what I'll do is that, since I think you have some time, is that this is to connect with many of you who are going to listen to or have already listened to several lectures which will be delivered solely in Hindi. I, as a scholar, believe that when we do things in English and when we do things in Indian languages, they are the same things, and at the same time, they are not the same things. And this is an important distinction. Just imagine if I would have given this lecture in Hindi, it would have been a different lecture, but at the same time, about the same thing. So, in compensation, partly, and also in terms of suggestively concluding our discussion, what I'm going to do is that just to give you a hint, is that how people have thought about folk in modern India. As a modern historian, I'm taking my examples from there. One is, just imagine, historians know this very well. Some of them are interested in culture. And I'm giving all examples from Hindi literature, contemporary modern Hindi literature itself. Someone like Vasudev Sharan Agrawal, a great Indologist, historian, who was director of Mathura Museum, who was a great ancient historian, Paninian scholar, many things, was someone who has given us a great riches in his writings on thinking about lok itself, folk itself. And there are many ways in which he tries to define and redefine what could be called as both the definition, philosophical, conceptual definition of lok, at the same, in the larger textual tradition, at the same time, how one should study the lok. And he says, talks about the Lok Varta Shastra in one of his essays. He actually was someone who was interested in using the term Janpad, not as just the district, as you see in the state of Uttar Pradesh or many other states, but a Janpad as a cultural totality, as a cultural unit, and how to study it. And he suggests, in some senses, given the time, I would have read out certain lines and paragraphs from him, which are very important and very important to understand and think about. But what he does is that, as a nationalist, as a cultural nationalist, who was an erudite, a scholar, important scholar, Vasudev Sharan Agrawal actually hints at folk, lok, or lok varta, as he says, shastra, or the janpad, study of janpad, as something which is actually sanskriti ke bhule hue path, It means in some senses, you go back to the lost ways or paths of culture itself. So it's very much part of that. At the same time, I tend to see is that he saw folk or the folk culture as a grand archive or kind of abhilekhagar of the living Indian lives of the Indian people. Someone like Hajari Prasad Dwivedi, who constantly goes back to the term lok again, and in a very rich way, he uses, like Vasudev Sharan Agrawal, uses this term. And he actually reminds us of something very, very important, is that while one should be fond of talking about Bharatiya Sanskriti or Hindu Sanskriti, Bharatiya Itihas or Itihas, but mostly he's talking about Bharatiya Sanskriti and Hindu Sanskriti, he constantly reminds us that once we talk about what we come to talk about the people and the lok and the general idea of is that is and the way it defines our idea of culture is meant by Arya evam Aryetar. He always reminds in his writings that both the Aryans and the non-Aryans, he's writing in a certain context, and a large part of what we call as Indian life is actually created by not only the so-called classical tradition or the division between the classical and folk. So what Hajar Prasad Dwivedi hints at is that the very distinction right in the beginning, which we are talking about, classical and the folk, he says that actually they not only mirror, but such distinctions in Indian culture and thinking about doesn't work because it's a culture created by dissenters, outsiders, mixtures, and he constantly reminds of yakshas and gandharvas who actually are part of who are seen as the non-aryans elements of Indian culture. And one example of Vidyanivas Mishra, closer, who was a great Sanskrit scholar, grammarian, he talks about lok in many places in his writings, in modern writings, where he talks about while what we call lok, which is the living life, the lived life, the life as we see it in its content, is marked by both vyavastha, it means it has a system, continuity, but at the same time, it is marked by changes, continuous and radical changes. Now, as a historian, I should be faithful in the old-fashioned way and end with a historian's remark, which is our D.D. Koshambi. One of his very famous essays, which I've been very fond of and very enriching for us, is Combined Methods of Indology, where Didi Koshambi shows us that what that the study of Indian culture and society is in its long perspective should actually take care of two very important facts. One is that it is marked by survivals. It's a society where survivals are not there in the museums, are not to be museumized. Survivals are there, as he reminded all of us that you just one should try walking in his or her own neighborhood, whether you are living in a city or whether you are living in a kasbah. He himself did it. And then out of that, what comes out is what he calls combined methods of Indology, and where Koshambi actually looks into one very important term, ibhya, and shows us that just opening up one term, one can actually start opening of larger cultural formation and the lives of the people. That's another thing. I think I should stop here, and I have tried to give you a map of a concept, a rich concept, and rather a complex concept. I wanted to take away the neatness of the concept, but like all of you, I also love this idea of the folk and the term lok, which is we all are very fond of, but never forgetting that it has a very complex and rich history around it. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Rakesh ji. I think that was a wonderful journey that you took us on. Uh, I just wanted to share this that we've had wonderful lectures that has given different, like you also mentioned in your lecture, that folk is not just one thing, but it has a variant this thing. But I think what you took us and what you explained was the basic theoretical understanding. And I also agree with you, like you said, that you've also given some questions regarding the concept, because uh, when you understand something, then definitely after that understanding, you come out with some questions that you have in your mind regarding that concept. Now, राकेश जी, बिफोर, इससे पहले कि मैं आगे बढ़ूं, और मुझे वो बहुत अच्छी लगी आपकी बात, मैं आपको आपसे शेयर करना चाहूंगी राकेश जी कि हमने फोक ट्रेडिशन इन म्यूजिक पे लेक्चर रखा. We've had performers performing on folk dances. We've had folk nritya. We had swang. So we've tried to incorporate all the nuances and all the things that you have been giving us and mentioning here. So that is what is the aim of this course, and our principal sir has tried his best to guide the team to incorporate all these perspectives. Now, before going more into it, because as a historian, there are many questions that are coming to my mind, but I'll just take I'll just try first taking questions from the participants. And please, I'm sorry about my voice. I'm a bit unwell. So my apologies for that. The first question is from Pallavi Mishra. I'm just going to read it out, Rakesh ji. She writes, folk is not non-urban and non-industrial. Rather, there are urban folklores that bear a transnational nature and cannot be rooted out by modernity. The urban folklores have an inclusive secular note, which is liberating, emerging beyond groups, factions, boundaries. Many of Walt Disney's animated films, from Cinderella to Snow White, have brought folk tales to large audience. I hope you make the sense of her comment, Rakesh ji. And I'll just go to another question. This is from Jyotsna. She writes, she says, it is an incredible session, particularly the romantic movement influence on the folk arts. And I think I also had this point in my mind about Jyotsna ji's writing. Indeed, it was an incredible session, particularly the romantic movement influence on folk arts. 18th century British romantic poet Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, where he attributes poetry to spontaneous flow of emotions, to be written in rustic language, to be understood by common people, subscribe to our folk ideas of naturalness, rustic language. Jyotsna ji is, I think, from Department of English. So this is her observation. So I would like your reactions and comments on this, Rakesh ji.
Yeah, so thank you so much. And I think, as we had discussed, and I should say again that in our discussions now, we can be bilingual. Like I'll be happily speaking in Indian English. Yeah, so that should something which should be understood. Is that I agree with that. The point, which is the first point about the contemporary urban folklore. I think there urban, what we call, I totally agree with that. There are very, very many ways in which new folklore is emerging, and also the folk is being reinterpreted as we see it in different ways, and also in a secular ways, as we say that there are ways in which they are secularized, reinterpreted. That we all would agree with as it happens. Think about a lot of Rajasthani folk on which the theater and films are made, short stories are written. So the use of folk, the way in which the folk is used in the contemporary literary and cultural forms, they are varied. They are very rich. They stand with us in very different forms. But they are of two kinds. A lot of them are reinventions. Odyssey is a very good example, which we call a classical dance. Is a best example of invention of tradition, which happens. But we treat it as a form of culture. We are actually looking into what happens to the idea itself. Now, once we just imagine, we say that there is urban folklore. Once we say something urban folklore, here the term folklore is used more and in a metaphorical sense, right? Rather than the way we understand folklore, right? So here, this use of folklore is slightly different from the way we call it. Maybe centuries and decades down the line, it will be an important thing to look into what kind of folklore they are. But as I understand, when we say that urban folklore, so folklore is more of a metaphorical use of folklore, which is about the contemporary urban cultural forms which are emerging. And they are called folklore because the appeal of the folklore which is there.
Right.
Connect folklore establishes, which is important. And in our discussion, we talked about is that because folklore is both enchanting and enigmatic. That's the point I was making, right? And why don't we just call urban songs? Why do we call it urban folklore? Because there is an element of which actually is distinct for just calling it urban songs or urban cultural forms. And that is a very good use of the term folklore, but I see it more as a different kind of ways in which folklore is something, apart from the folk, is something which is in all cultures, is always, it's the name of something which we see as more naturally and widely shared thing. Both its evolution is very natural, and both its consumption, its uses are very wide, largely shared. That is why we call it folklore. It becomes almost, when we say that, look, this story has almost, just imagine, if there is a contemporary anecdote and someone says that, look, don't you know, this has become a folklore. Now, this is a metaphoric piece. It means that this is something which everyone naturally shares and understands. And it's happening in modern culture too. Of course it is happening. We are creating new folk forms.
It's something like, since she mentioned, Pallavi Mishra mentioned about Snow White, I always had this problem, like in most of of these fairy tales as a kid also, when we used to read these in our convent schools. And as I grew up and started working on gender, I always had a problem with this issue of, stepmother ko kaise, she's given that evil structure or the evil side, Hansel and Gretel, and also with the concept of witch. So there are certain, like what you're saying, absolutely right, that कि कुछ concepts जो होते हैं, जो western उसके concept है, folk के, I mean, I personally feel that they have to be challenged. As a gender historian, I feel that and I've always challenged this. So they are not very, I mean, I personally don't find them as urban or as, progressive. So the element of analysis and criticism, I think it should always be there. And we should try to, try to analyze that perspective. That's just my observation. I mean, because this used to disturb me always. Whenever I used to read a fairy tale, the main character, and in our Indian traditions, like stepmother ka concept as a hai nahi. We've had lovely stories where the stepmother brings up the child and supports. So there are certain traditions, and I don't know if we would want to call it tradition, but they should be analyzed and they should be explored. Now, before I continue, I would like to share, Rakesh ji, that Sangeeta Agarwal ji keh rahi hai, nice session. संजय, डॉक्टर संजय वाघमारे कह रहे हैं नाइस लेक्चर. तारा जी कह रही है थैंक यू सर for a very comprehensive and detailed aspect of folk, with history and other tangent societies. I definitely agree with this because in such a short time, आपने जो एक understanding दी है folk की, I think Tara ji is right when she says this. There's a comment and a question, I think, from Dr. Prerna Sinha. A lot of folk tales and folk culture is being revisited. Can we see it as a celebration of folk and assimilated into our popular culture? ये प्रेरणा जी का सवाल है कि I'll just repeat once again. A lot of folk tales and folk culture is being revisited, and she's asking, can we see it as a celebration of folk and assimilated into our popular culture? This is Prerna Sinha's question.
Yeah, I think you're right on both counts. Is that it is a reinterpretation. There is also an element of appreciation, celebration, appreciation. Think of Shah Rukh Khan's famous movie on Rajasthani folktale, which Manikal had earlier done as a parallel cinema, Duvidha, the famous Vijay Dandetha, this story, which is it was part of folklore, a kind of folktale, which a short story writer writes as a story. It turns into a modern genre, and then a filmmaker, a modernist filmmaker, someone like Manikal, experimental modernist, but at the same time, someone who knew the Indian culture very, very deeply and very sensitively. He does a film on that. And then there is a much, much popular Bollywood movie on that with Shah Rukh Khan. I'm forgetting the name of that very film. Is the very popular film which was done on the same thing. So you can actually see what is happening. There is something which is there in the form of a folk tale or folklore. It comes as a short story, very creatively done by Vijay Dandetha. It's a great.
The movie is Paheli. Amitesh.
Paheli, yes, it comes as a Paheli. Then there is someone who's an avant-garde experimental filmmaker, influenced by Bresson, the French filmmaker, and who knew so much about Indian art and Indian traditions, and knew Rajasthan too, miniature art and all, Drupad and all kind of influences. And he makes a film on that. Very austere, very different kind of narrativization takes place. Then you have a film which is a grand Bollywood film, which is Paheli. Now it's a very good example for us to look at it. Is Paheli an urban folklore? As we go to the very first question, comment, very interesting. One can say that, look, Paheli is an attempt at creating an urban folklore. Is it some kind of celebration of the folk, or is it just the creation of a new popular, which is Bollywood in some senses, or contemporary entertainment commercial entertainment cinema, as we know it, is doing it. At one level, we all would agree that, of course, it is a kind of new folklore, which Paheli film is there. At the same time, there is an appreciation and celebration. Everything is happening here, the way we are characterizing it. But at a different level, as Mubin just mentioned, is that when we look at it, it's the treatment of these elements which is important for us. For us who are in the business of criticizing, understanding, doing scholarship and humanities and all that, is that we, as she mentioned about the gender questions, which has come up in certain elements. And there is a huge industry. This is, again, this in itself is a topic of research in some ways, and understanding is that how popular culture, a variety of forms in popular culture actually, which are commercialized, industrialized, modernist form of entertainment, use folk elements. New novels in the West, not in India as much, but in the West, as we all know, that all these fairy tales, the new novel, children's novel, children's literature, comics, cinema, all this is full of that. So the way the contemporary popular uses and marshals, one can say, the folk is a complex system. It's an Avatar movie. It's an interesting thing. When Hollywood features, one can actually talk about that. So all that happens. But what I would go back to something very, very basic, which I mentioned, began and ended, is that look at the way we understand the idea of the folk versus classical, folk versus history, folk versus tradition, and all that. And then you watch Paheli, or then you watch these children's comics and movies. That's one thing. The other thing is that, which I mentioned, is that the neatness or the naivety of the concept of the folk, as we say. So Mubin gave a very good example, is that one of our naiveties or neatness, which is there in the folk itself, gender is a very good example, is that hits at us, that no, that neatness cannot be handled here anymore. But there are other ways, because in the first Pallavi Mishra's question, she used the term secular, very interesting term. And I'll give you an example of a secular use of the folk, which is actually about religion itself, which is much more complex and much more interesting and beautiful. The Marathi English poet, very well-known English poet, Arun Kolatkar, and many poets in Indian languages, in English itself, they have treated, look at the treatment of the folk. So the whole Vithoba journey and about around Vithoba, Arun Kolatkar wrote a series of poems. And he's writing these poems as a modernist. He is influenced by modernist poetry in English, mostly mid 20th century, right? And he is writing about a tradition which is both a living tradition, one can call is part of our folk, it's religious, and someone is doing something which is high modernist at the same time. And if you look at those poems and you read it, and he also does it in Marathi and English himself, that too. So there are different ways in which this actually operates. So these are about the uses of appreciation of marshalling, channelizing folk, which in itself is a very, very important. Now, I gave you the example of Odyssey is a great example in some form, which we call classical. Someone can say that, look, no, it was a kind of folk form. Which becomes classical. That's it. Or the Duvidha story is a short story, is a very good example. Or the movies example, where our basic concepts are challenged. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. There is another example that one of our participants, Dr. Munna Pandey, he's saying, he mentions Girish Karnad's Nag Mandal is also another example.
Yeah, many of this.
As we already mentioned, Paheli, he mentions about that also. Yeah. I think there are many questions coming. There are a lot of thank yous coming to you, Rakesh ji, from our participants. They are very happy to have such a detailed point wise and a very what do you say, a very mapping kind of a theoretical mapping understanding of the term, I would say. And Amitesh ji has already joined. We are having the next session with Amitesh ji from 3:30 onwards. So questions to are rahe and but due to paucity of time, I think I'll have to give the formal vote of thanks to Dr. Rakesh Pandey, who I think I just love your style of detailing the topic. And I'm sure our participants would agree with me, मेरी बात से इत्तेफाक रखेंगे कि जिस तरह से आपने इस कॉन्सेप्ट को एक माइन्यूट फोक अंडरस्टैंडिंग से एक लार्जर प्रोस्पेक्ट्स में आप लेके गए, और मैं आपके ही शब्दों में you mentioned that folk becomes a repository, and indeed the way you mentioned different perspectives and this entire refresher course का ये एक एम है, आप कह सकते हैं मकसद है कि ये फोक को रिपोजिटरी के तौर पे हम, और रिपोजिटरी में कोई एक पर्सपेक्टिव नहीं होता है, बहुत कुछ होता है. सो दैट रिपोजिटरी एंड दैट अंडरस्टैंडिंग. So now on behalf of Atmaram Sanatan Dharm College, my principal, Professor Gyantush Kumar Jha, the IQAC coordinator and chief, Vinita Tuliji, and my team. And on behalf of all the participants who very patiently listened and shared their views, and I'm sure they're very happy because I am getting a lot of messages. I'm sorry because of the
Yeah.
paucity of time, unable to read, Rakesh ji,
No,
but
thanks.
आपका
I would
बहुत
just say, yeah, I would just say one line. I would like to thank all of you. Thank Mubin. Thank Principal Yantosh Shaji. At the same time, that could have been another journey which I didn't do here, given the time, is to actually look into the entering into the whole idea of the folk itself. Many questions which are hinted at. Maybe that's a different exercise. Some other time we'll do it. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. That concluding statement already explains your seriousness and your love for your research, because I know that you're such a serious researcher and you come out with such serious notions and concepts and understanding. So on that note, I wish you all the best, Rakesh ji, and thank you for joining us and giving time and sharing your immense knowledge with us. Thank you, and we wish you all the best. A big thank you from my technical team also, because we are nothing without them. So I would like to thank my technical team also, Dr. Abid Hussain, Ravinder ji, Amit ji, Shivaji, and all these colleagues of mine who are the technical team. And on behalf of all the participants, once again, Rakesh ji, I thank you. Thank you for taking time out. Thank you so much. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया.
So much.